This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. All this may mean something.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. Well, we haven't run out of history quite yet.
Welcome everyone to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture, and how Star Trek relates to it. My name is Tony Black, and with me is Duncan Barrett.
Hi, Tony.
How are you, Duncan? You all right?
Yeah, I'm not bad. How are you?
I'm very well. I'm wondering if anyone knows who we are, who is listening to this at this stage. You may recognise my voice from Trek FM's own Standard Orbit, where I've popped up a couple of times, and Duncan is been on Metatreks before.
I have.
Yeah, where you most recently guested on a 2-part episode which explored historical connections through DS9's Season 6 Essential Trek Philosophy, which I know the guys on Metatreks have been going through and doing all different seasons. And that was, I think we can both say, that was one of the main inspirations for the show we're bringing you all today, really, isn't it?
I did, yeah. I mean, I think that's right. I feel like I sort of co-opted that episode of Metatreks. It wasn't meant to be a 2-part episode. That was just because that was me banging on for too long about World War II history, which is kind of my patch, basically. I write popular history books, generally about the Second World War. So I think I was sort of bringing my passion there, and I went on for so long that in the end they decided they better split that interview into 2. But yeah, it did make me think. Then you got in touch with me and you're talking about doing this project, and I sort of thought, yeah, actually, there's quite a lot to bring to that. I think in terms of looking at the relationship between real world history and Star Trek, and also opening it out a bit to look at literature and film and so on, and aspects of our real world. What Deanna Troi in First Contact calls a primitive culture. That's kind of us. We're the primitive culture, and how that feeds into the kind of imaginary 23rd, 24th centuries.
Yeah, and that's essentially why we're called Primitive Culture, really. That's where, when we were batting around show ideas and thinking, well, we've got the general idea of the show in that we want to cover all these, historical parallels and these connections to Trek, as two people who are hugely, Trek fans and have been for years. I think it was you who came up with the Deanna Troi thing, and I was like, yes, that fits.
Well, otherwise we were going to be stuck with cultural treks or historical treks or something along those lines. I just thought we should try and come up with something different, just to stand out a bit in some way. I don't know, and also to try and cover all those bases in a way.
Yeah, exactly, and that's the big thing. If you're listening to this, you might be thinking, well, what kind of show is this going to be? Episode by episode. What are we going to be, talking about? So we thought we'd, go into a little bit more detail about that, and maybe our inspirations for this a little bit more before we talk about our main first discussion topic. And we've picked a discussion topic that we're both very interested in, that we've done, we've researched, which is looking at the historical figure of J. Robert Oppenheimer. And he was the scientist who invented the atomic bomb in the 1940s at the end of World War II. And how he as a character was reflected in 2 guest characters who appeared in Star Trek Voyager and Star Trek Enterprise. So that's going to be our main topic that we're going to talk about in detail later. But before we get there, what kind of show are we going to be bringing people every episode, Duncan?
Well, I think the way I see it, and I hope that we're on the same page with this, is that we're going to try and keep it as varied as possible. So, we're looking at a pretty solid kind of historical story this time. This is a real historical person, and these characters were quite explicitly based on him. I mean, if you go to Memory Alpha, read the interviews with Ken Biller, who wrote the Voyager episode, with Brannon Braga, who obviously wrote most of Enterprise. This was a very conscious decision to base these characters on Oppenheimer. But then maybe next week we might be looking at a literary topic, looking at Moby Dick in First Contact, something like that. The week after we might be looking at film, at a sort of cinematic debt that Star Trek has. So we're basically treating this idea of culture quite broadly, looking at it in terms of our history, our literary culture, our other forms of creative culture, and the way that really the writers of Star Trek have drawn on all those things, because they're not just coming up with ideas in a void, partly because they're historically were bashing out 24, 26 episodes a year. They're pulling in all directions to try and get inspiration, and that's really what we want to look at, is from a writing perspective, where do those inspirations come from?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think we want to keep as much as we can in a historical frame, and looking at things, looking at culture through that lens, and looking at, as you say, at where all these great stories came from. And as many people know, Star Trek, the majority of Star Trek has a very real world basis, from all kinds of things, even down to, the basic template of all the different races. You can, and I'm sure we'll go into this in a future episode, but, you can look at the Federation as analogous to the, United States, and the Klingons as the Russians, and all these kind of different things. There's a lot to talk about in the Star Trek universe. As we've been discussing this over the last few weeks and coming up with the podcast itself, we've had a significant amount of ideas, I think, haven't we? That
we have, yeah.
Forward.
We've probably got enough ideas for the next year or two of episodes.
Yeah, I think so.
If only, doing it all is as easy as just coming up with these ideas off the top of our heads. But we'll see which of those make it through in the end, and which we ditch later on.
And I'm sure there'll be a few along the way. But I think as well for us, you're a writer, you're a historian. I'm a writer I'm not a historian, but I love history. I do write. I do obviously podcasting elsewhere as well. But I think we both have a real interest and love of history. So I think it's and culture, and it's something that we found certainly even with this first episode, we found ourselves educating ourselves on things we didn't know previously. So if we can share a little bit of that knowledge without being ponderous, then that will be part of the the mission statement as well, I think, won't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I have to say, yes, I write history books, but I know quite a lot about a number of very small kind of minor areas. I mean, I'd say I know a lot more about Oppenheimer now than I did a week ago, certainly. So, and I think that's the way it's going to be for a lot of these episodes, is really, we're probably only a few steps ahead of the audience, but we know what topics we want to look at, and we're going to go and do the research and hopefully come to the podcast, reasonably well briefed on what it is that we're talking about that week.
Yeah. We can hope. That's the idea.
That's the idea, yeah. And if not, we'll just wing it.
But if anyone out there, who's listening has ideas for episodes, or, particular topics from the Star Trek universe that, link to our culture and our history, do feel free to let us know. Talk to us on the Babel conference and over Twitter, Facebook, etc. Get involved, let us know. And, we can, I'm sure you've got tons of ideas as well as we have. So, we want to really dig deep into this and mine into some of these amazing concepts and these amazing ideas that Star Trek has, and really sort of unpick, in many respects, where they came from, which is the same as where we came from, which is the whole, idea of Star Trek and the big adventure. So this is kind of our big adventure, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, it's not just, we're talking about it historically, it's history to us. In some cases, that the things that we're looking at the time, they weren't history then. When the original series is dealing with the Cold War, that's history to us now. But, that was current events. That was kind of ripped from the headlines. Similarly, Enterprise dealing with 9/11 and the Iraq War and so on, the kind of aftermath of that. We can just about start to begin to look back on that period as a kind of as a historical period in a sense, although we haven't quite escaped from it yet. But it's partly also looking at what are the conditions that produce these stories, what are the influences on these writers, where are their ideas coming from, and that could be many different directions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as we said before, there's lots of different directions that we can go in. So, I think we're very excited about this. We hope you guys are quite excited to see where we go with it. And this seems like a good as point of it as any to launch into our first topic this week. So let's talk a little bit about the main central figure who our first topic pivots around. And that is, as I mentioned before, the real-life historical figure of J. Robert Oppenheimer, who, Duncan, who was J. Robert Oppenheimer?
So, the J stands for Julius. I only know that because I looked it up on Wikipedia, but he went by Robert Oppenheimer, or Oppie, as he was known colloquially. And I suppose the reason that maybe is relevant is what's interesting, I think, and particularly when we look at these scientist characters in Star Trek who were based on him, is we tend to have this image, I think, of the scientist as this sort of solitary genius who works on their own, who is kind of antisocial and, can't necessarily deal with other people. Actually, Oppenheimer was almost the opposite of that. He was a professor of physics at the University of California in Berkeley, and he was a very popular, very charismatic teacher. And one of the reasons, actually, that he was chosen as the guy who was going to lead this massive endeavour to try to build the atomic bomb was not so much because he was the kind of lone genius who was the only one who could understand it. It was actually because partly he had quite a broad understanding of various aspects of science. He could do the really cutting-edge theoretical stuff, but he could also do the kind of more applied stuff. But it was also really because he was a people person. He was this inspirational teacher. He was used to working with large groups of people, with inspiring them. And I think that's what they felt, really, is they had this, the army was putting together this project. They were drawing on the greatest minds. They were bringing in all these geniuses with their idiosyncratic, eccentric, difficult personalities. And they really needed someone who could kind of pull them all together and get them working on the same team and get the best out of them. And in a sense, that's what they got in Oppenheimer. It was quite controversial, apparently, at the time that that they chose someone who hadn't been awarded the Nobel Prize, which he hadn't, and because there were sort of better scientists essentially out there that they could have chosen, but they chose this guy, and seems to me they probably chose the right guy because it was an extremely difficult job that required all these different people and their different expertise and so on, and he seemed to be able to kind of hold it all together somehow and keep that project running.
Yeah, he did really. He was a fascinating figure, Oppenheimer, in that he's known in many respects these days in very mixed terms, in that he, as they say, the father of the atomic bomb, is obviously being, to a degree, a little bit simplistic. The atomic bomb and the creation of what eventually the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was very much a massive combined effort in Los Alamos, which was in New Mexico, which is where Oppenheimer built the laboratory based on places he'd been in his childhood, and he had a great deep love of the area around Los Alamos. He'd spent many times there. He used to horseback ride there with his brother and with family friends all the way through his youth. And he built Los Alamos. He wanted Los Alamos built as a place that he could feel like he was completely at home. And an entire community built up around the creation of this atomic bomb. And Oppenheimer was he was that inspirational, as you said, that inspirational leader. He was that central figure, but he wasn't a traditional leader. He was a very thin, wafer thin man. He was eccentric. He was a bit nervy. He had difficult, complicated relationships with his family, with women. He was married, and he had various different women. He didn't have a problem attracting women, but he had very difficult, complicated relationships with people. So he wasn't a traditional leader in the military sense, and he had to deal with a lot of very different people. He had to deal with military generals, he had to deal with politicians, he had to deal with the overhanging spectre of many people believing he was a communist as well, which at the time was the worst thing you could possibly be in America, during the war and especially after the war. So he wasn't, people nowadays think of him, he's that famous quote that he took from the Bhagavad Gita. He was a very spiritual person as well. He did a lot of reading. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds, which has been popularized over the last half century. But he wasn't, like most people in this kind of role, he wasn't that simplistically drawn. And ultimately, he was, in many respects, he was a liberal. He had very left-wing kind of sensibilities, which is what drew him into very flirtatious, elements of dealing with the Communist Party in the 20s and the 30s before they were demonized. So in later years, he ended up becoming somebody who in many respects, regretted what he'd created. You know, the Pandora's box he'd opened. I think if he could have shut it again, he would have done.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think, you know, it may be that when we look at these characters of Jetrel and Degra, we sort of need to a certain extent to recognise the difference between Oppenheimer the man and Oppenheimer the myth, because I think in later years, he was opposed. He did express opposition to the proliferation of nuclear weapons, to the development of the hydrogen bomb, and so on. So I suppose he expressed this sentiment that you've mentioned very famously, quoting the Bhagavad Gita. But there's a kind of tension there. You know, he wasn't necessarily always the anguished scientist. He said when he was asked, I think, something that Jetrel says as well, he didn't regret what he'd done. I mean, there were other scientists on the Manhattan Project at the time before the bomb was dropped who were having more serious qualms, who were sort of saying, are we sure that we're doing the right thing? And there were kind of moves to say, especially after Germany surrendered, because I think that when they were all brought on board, the Germans under Heisenberg were developing their own nuclear program, and it was very much a race to see who would get the atomic bomb first, and that country would win the war. Then obviously once Germany had surrendered, the terms of what they were doing changed completely, because there was no longer this threat of annihilation. The threat was to their soldiers out fighting the Japanese, and obviously many American soldiers were being killed, and there was a desire to end the war quickly. But at the same time, there wasn't that direct threat to their entire country, to their entire way of life, you know, to their ability to win the war. And I think that did change the conditions to a certain extent. On the other hand, the army had put, you know, millions of dollars into this project. They weren't going to just say, oh, all right, we don't need this weapon anymore. So there's a sort of sense of like, once the train has started moving, what can they do? But there's also the question of how much are the scientists really responsible? Because I think what Oppenheimer would have said, which, you know, is something that comes up, certainly Jetrel makes this argument as well, is that ultimately he was doing the science. You know, he was developing the scientific methodology needed to make the weapon. He wasn't the one deciding who to drop it on, or you know, whether to drop it or not. That's sort of someone else's decision, and that has to be left to them. So there's this sort of idea, I suppose, of is science, and maybe we'll come to this a bit more when we talk about Jetrel, because there are some great discussions in that episode about this subject. But, you know, is science kind of morally neutral, or and does it have a kind of intrinsic value in and of itself, or is it impossible to separate that from these kind of moral questions? And what is the responsibility of the scientist in that situation?
It is that moral quandary. Just because you can do something, should you? And this is the whole thing. Oppenheimer is a fascinating case, and it is reflected in Jetrel, and to a degree Degra, in that what he was doing, in fact, probably more so with Degra, what he was doing because he was a patriot. And he was doing, in his eyes, he was a patriot. He was trying to win the war. It wasn't a case of, should we do this? Should we do this? He was saying, if we don't do this, Germany will. And this is what his main inspiration was, all through, you know, getting involved in the project, building Los Alamos into what it was, up to the point of, you know, the Trinity test in 1945, and then, you know, beyond. His motivation was very much a case of, we need to do this, because if we don't, the other side will, and we could lose. And that is a very powerful motivation for even potentially creating something that, in moral terms, you have to stop and think, should we have gone there? Should we have opened this box? Because it did change the world. You know, nuclear power in the arms race, and having, you know, what eventually became, you know, mutually assured destruction, was set the pace, set the template for the entire 20th century and beyond.
Absolutely. I mean, I think Degra in some ways has more in common in that sense, because obviously, you know, we find out in that season of Enterprise that Degra has only created this terrible weapon, which he himself feels very conflicted about, because he's seen the damage that's caused, because he believes that his entire species is under threat. You know, that the humans are going to wipe them out. So it's very much in the spirit of Oppenheimer developing this weapon because he knows that the Germans are working on it too. And, you know, Heisenberg is there with his laboratory in Germany, and it's really a race to see who's going to annihilate the other one, in a sense. So I think that comes across quite strongly there. I think there's another aspect, though, that I feel you get this somewhat off Jetrel probably more than Degra, and that is certainly true of Oppenheimer, is that there's also an element of pride and an element of ambition, to be honest. I mean, I think he wasn't a sort of in a sense, that sort of pure image of a scientist who only cares about the science, who doesn't really care about himself or whatever. We've talked a bit about he was this charismatic professor. He was quite a sort of personable guy. He liked the attention. He liked the sense of triumph, of succeeding in this great endeavour. If you read the descriptions of what he was like immediately after that Trinity test went off successfully. I mean, although in later years he talks about thinking of this line from the Bhagavad Gita and the kind of the horror of it in a sense. There's descriptions of him throwing his arms in the air, making these very kind of bombastic speeches, generally celebrating this great achievement that he'd made and knowing that he'd sort of earned himself a place in history. And in a sense, that line, it's kind of, I'm become death, destroyer of worlds. There's a kind of ambiguity there because it is this kind of terrible vision, but it's also, almost glorious, isn't it? It's sort of glorifying the destruction and the horror of it. And I think in a way there's that kind of ambiguity to Oppenheimer. He's not someone who was so sort of psychologically destroyed by his creation and his role in this awful thing that he could never live with himself. He was a lot more conflicted than that. He was very proud of what he'd achieved, which was an amazing achievement. He felt that he'd had good reasons for doing it. At the same time, obviously, he couldn't get past the fact that all these people had been killed and it was awful, and they'd unleashed this kind of terrible force into the world. So I suppose it's maybe just a slightly more ambivalent, slightly more ambiguous, slightly more nuanced kind of character, really, than in some ways the kind of cultural idea of Oppenheimer, which is that we sort of assume that the scientist who's done this feels terrible about it and is racked with guilt for the rest of their life. And interestingly, it's, I suppose, because the Nazis didn't, Heisenberg didn't succeed in creating the nuclear bomb. If the Nazis had created the nuclear bomb and used it to bomb the Allies, it would fit easily with our kind of narratives about the Second World War, which are obviously, almost exclusively about kind of Nazi brutality, about the Holocaust, about all these terrible things. The Second World War is this kind of rupture in our kind of global society, in a sense, where these awful things happen. But what's interesting about this one is obviously, we were meant to be the good guys. This was us doing it, and it was us who created this terrible thing. And so there's a lot of uncomfortable feelings about that. And I think in some ways they get sort of pinned onto Oppenheimer, whether or not he really wanted to be the kind of poster boy for, sort of atomic angst and guilt and so on, that in some ways people kind of wanted him to be. Yeah, absolutely. It as I said before, there is a complexity to the man, and as time goes on, and as he gets older and has, the reflections on what he created, and ultimately, Oppenheimer lived till 1967. He wasn't an old man when he died, but he lived long enough to see things like, the growing arms race of the 1950s, the Cuban Missile Crisis, in 1962. The subsequent assassination of JFK. He saw these huge events that, were in many respects, a consequence. Well, they were a consequence of creating the atomic bomb. So he lived to see a lot of that. And I think towards his later years, that, that confliction and that complexity to the man deepened even more so. And I think it's that kind of complexity is reflected in these two characters from Star Trek who, were in many respects, not necessarily both directly, but were, influenced heavily by the real life figure of Oppenheimer. So let's talk about Jetrel first. Maybor Jetrel, who appeared in the episode Jetrel in the first season of Star Trek Voyager, and he was a doctor. He was a Harkonian scientist who was who created a weapon called the Metreon Cascade in 2356 that was used against the Talaxians on a moon called Rhinax in an attempt to end the conflict ultimately that had been going on. And following the use of the weapon, the Talaxian government gave their unconditional surrender the following day, and the war was over. And in the episode Jetrel, the Doctor himself turns up on Voyager on the pretext of trying to help Neelix, who obviously presents himself in this case as a former soldier who lost people on Rhinax and has been haunted by this, for many years. And Neelix, he tells Neelix he's dying. He's dying of poisoning from that event. And it immediately, the key thing with Jetrel is all of these elements are exactly the same thing as the events in real life. The Metreon Cascade is the bomb. Rhinax is Nagasaki or Hiroshima. You have the poisoning is analogous to radiation poisoning and all these different things. And the parallels are
enormously overt, aren't they, with Jetrel straight away?
It's a very sort of clear, in that kind of classic Star Trek tradition, it's a very sort of straightforward allegory in a sense. I mean, it is their, Hiroshima episode in a sense. And of course, this was 1995 when Voyager was debuting. I'm not sure whether this was... Maybe it had touched into 96, I don't know, by the time this episode was broadcast. But, basically 50 years since these events. So it's almost a kind of anniversary episode, I think, kind of looking at this topic and, very much putting it with the Star Trek lens and finding a way to tell that story. And interestingly, of course, telling that story with Neelix, who we think of as this kind of comic relief character, as a sort of a bit of a clown in a sense. And I think it's quite interesting. I mean, in some ways they didn't have much choice because obviously this is a story that takes place in the Delta Quadrant. They've only got 2 Delta Quadrant natives on the ship, and and they can't really tell a story like that about Kes because we know she lived underground for her whole life, and there's not much sort of backstory to feed off there. But I think it's quite interesting then that they choose. Or that the choice is kind of put upon them if they want to tell that story, that it has to be Neelix's story, because it really helps you understand that character, I think, and it puts that kind of clownishness in context a bit. And also, I think Ethan Phillips does a fantastic job in this episode. I mean, I think whenever they give Neelix more serious stuff to do, I mean, I'm thinking Mortal Coil as well, another great episode, he really brings it to the table. And it's a shame in some ways that maybe we don't get more of that. And if we did, maybe the people who find Neelix annoying and kind of irritating and can't stand him might, in a way, have a bit more sympathy for that character. But I think it works really well. All the stuff about his family works really well. And I think in a way it's an unusual choice to tell this story with your comedy character in comparison, say, to Deep Space Nine when they had the episode Duet, which this apparently was very consciously trying to recreate that feeling that there was in Duet of this kind of, almost like a sort of 2-person play, a lot of it, a real kind of morality tale, a really kind of deep, heavy, intense story. Both those episodes are the kind of penultimate episode of their first season, so it's sort of staking a certain kind of serious claim to say, yes, it's a new show. It's different in various ways. Maybe it's not quite as dark and serious as Deep Space Nine, but we can do heavy episodes. We can do serious episodes. But obviously, Duet, they did a story with Kira, who's probably their most kind of anguished and angsty and serious. Has a really dark backstory of the occupation and the resistance and so on. And in Voyager, they do it with their kind of clown character, but really turn that on its head and show you it in a new light. And I think it works really well. I think it's a great episode.
Yeah, me too, actually. It's been many, many years since I watched Jetrel. Possibly since, broadcast, because Voyager isn't... I do like elements of Voyager. It's not my favourite Star Trek series, so I don't revisit it all the time. So it was a long time since I'd seen Jetrel, and I was impressed. I thought the writing was good. I thought it lacks the power of Duet, which... is a really phenomenal episode of TV, but it's for Voyager, which on the whole, skews much more towards the action adventure axis in many respects. It doesn't often have these very heavy, intense episodes. It's impressive. It's impressively done, and the character of Jetrel is, played by James Sloyan, who's a really good character actor anyway. He crops up in many, many different genre shows. He's been in, or he was more Paul, I think. He was Odo's father in inverted commas on DS9, and I imagine I'm sure he crops
also
up
the
in
Romulan
yes.
in the Defector.
I was going to say he was a Romulan on Next Generation.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Both also great performances and really interesting characters. Yeah,
absolutely. He's got this way in which he can play these kind of roles, and I think he does a really good job in making Jetrel an oddly sympathetic character in many respects. In that he's driven. In some respects he's unapologetic. In that he did what he had to do. I think you mentioned this earlier. He's driven by a simple fact of there was a war. I built something. I didn't do it. I didn't use it on people. I built it. We were trying to win a war. But then, like Oppenheimer later on in his life, Jetrel seems haunted. He seems haunted by what he's done. He suffered his own personal loss. He talks about how, and what's interesting is that Jetrel and Degra both have lost family because of in the subsequent of this. Jetrel lost his wife and his children. They left him. He says he paid a personal cost for his science because they said, well, you're a monster. The Cascade killed millions of people. You're a monster. You must be, in order to create something that would cause so much pain. So this whole story feels like his redemption and Neelix's coming to accept the lies he's been telling himself, because obviously we find out that Neelix was actually, as he terms himself, a coward. He was too afraid to fight and too afraid to go to Rhinax and be there. And he's been suffering survivor's guilt, really, for all this time.
Although it's a bit unclear, because he sort of, at first, he sort of represents himself as a conscientious objector, and then he blames himself, I suppose, for what happened to his family, for the fact that he wasn't, do you know what I mean? That he had placed, I mean, the way I read it, I think it's slightly ambiguous, the episode, but the way I read it is that, to give him the benefit of the doubt, maybe he was a conscientious objector, but having this experience where his whole family were killed made him feel like that was a stupid position to take, and that it was somehow cowardly to have done that. I don't know. I feel it's a bit. In some ways, I think that whole aspect of it slightly muddies the waters of the whole episode, and I'm not quite so sure about it, because it sort of brings in this whole other aspect to the story. But obviously that's, and it gives this quite tidy sort of ending, in a sense, where Kes basically says to him in this kind of pop psychology moment, maybe you're not really angry with Jetrel, maybe you're angry with yourself because you weren't there and you feel guilty about it. And I don't know, for me that sort of pop psychological aspect of it is the bit that works the least well. But
yes, I agree.
But I agree that I think it's really interesting, this idea of him losing losing his family over it. I mean, as far as I know, that didn't happen to Oppenheimer, but it did happen to the guy, I can't think of his name, but in the First World War, the German scientist who invented the gas, basically, his wife was so horrified that she actually committed suicide, because she felt her husband had in a similar way unleashed this awful thing on the world. And he probably would have said he was doing it in the name of science and also in the name of patriotism and so on. So it's kind of interesting that that sort of tension. I mean, with Degra, I don't think that's happened, but obviously there's a lot of kind of peril around his family, and are his family safe and so on. And there's also a kind of a tension which I'm sure must have been real for Oppenheimer as well. I mean, I don't know if in your reading you've come across this, but Degra talks about having brought his wife and family, his two kids, to live on this kind of military base, or wherever it is that they're making the weapon, and the extent to which it's taken over his life, it's consumed his life for many years, I think, by the point that we pick up the story because they launched that first probe. So there is definitely a sense of the kind of family cost for these men, and the kind of almost obsessive requirements of a project like this. I mean, one of the ideas I think behind the setup at Los Alamos, and I think this came from Oppenheimer, was that part of the idea for setting it in the middle of the desert was obviously there's kind of secrecy and so on, and there's the fact that he has this sentimental attachment to New Mexico, but there's also this idea of we've got to kind of basically lock these people up away from any distractions, away from any cities with kind of interesting things going on. And it's this kind of idea of getting all these great people and putting them almost in a sort of crucible where they can do their work and without distraction and without anything else going on. And obviously that's not a very healthy environment for human beings, in a sense.
No, and there was some really interesting tensions and issues in Los Alamos in that, and it's the same thing that Jetrel is describing. Exactly the same kind of thing. In the Harkonian creation of this bomb is what happened in real life. This whole sense of a trapped kind of community built up around Oppenheimer and this research. In that it started off as almost like an escape from the real world for people, because they like you said, they were in the middle of the desert. They were miles away from anything. But in the end, everyone knew everybody. It became very trapped. Certain, it even bred its own kind of ecosystem. There was an interesting story about how the military, and there was in Los Alamos, it was a general called Leslie Groves, who was a real ball breaker by the sound of it. He found out that a lot of the soldiers had been visiting what effectively was a whorehouse of certain girls and the younger women in the community who were offering their services, shall we say, and they stamped that out very quickly. So these kind of things built up around it. And interestingly, you talk about family. Oppenheimer didn't lose his family, but he actually, at one point, when he married a lady called Kitty, who wasn't, in many respects, his one true love. That was a woman named Jean Tatlock, who was a doctor and a scientist, who he kind of had this passionate love affair with for years, and then he left her behind when he went to Los Alamos to do all this. She ended up committing suicide, not because of that directly, but he felt some level of guilt based on that. And there was a very passionate kind of love affair. But he married a lady called Kitty, who came from certain oddly enough, ironically, certain Germanic stock going back, historically. She was quite a firebrand character, and she ended up bearing him a son, but she was very distant from the child. She would, go off and go horseback riding and things. They both were, and it actually came to a point where Oppenheimer asked one of his workers or one of his friends who was often looking after the baby if this person wanted to adopt the child, because he said, I can't love this person. I can't love this child. My devotion is to this bomb, is to the science. So it didn't happen in the end. I don't believe that the child was adopted, as far as I know, but it got to a point where he wasn't prioritizing family above everything else.
Which is interesting, just because, with the character of Degra, so much of that character is based around the fact that he's a father. And really that's the kind of key to his guilt, is totally wrapped up in this idea of the fact that he's murdered children, essentially. He says that he watched the telemetry of the probe that attacks Earth, that cuts a swathe through Florida and kills Trip Tucker's sister and 7 million other people. And he was sort of obsessed with this idea that some of those people were children, therefore they were innocent. They weren't the kind of acceptable targets, in a sense. And he says to one of the others, Indy, at one point, as a father, it's very hard for me to get my head around that, and really it's his children that he's trying to protect by saving the Zindi, by saving his civilization. So it's very much wrapped up in that, and also the fact that these kind of key things that allow Archer to bond with him are all wrapped up with his children as well. He knows the names of the two children at a key point. That's how he gets Degra's attention, because they've had this episode where they've wiped his memory, and Archer's constructed this fake scenario where they were imprisoned together, and he also knows this fact that he obviously hasn't told many people about a baby that he and his wife had that miscarried. And the fact that Archer knows that, again, is this kind of talisman, in a sense, of their close relationship. So I feel like again and again with Degra, it sort of comes back to children. It comes back to the conflict between him as a father, and seemingly a very loving father, and him as a scientist who's doing this terrible thing which involves, child killing, in a sense. And there's an interesting, slightly strange parallel, I think, actually, in that series of Enterprise with Archer, because in many ways the two of them are set up. They're almost a mirror for each other. I mean, what we get, and we get this a bit with Jetrel, and obviously, Oppenheimer might have said this too, but what Degra keeps saying is, look, I did what I had to do. I didn't like it. I wasn't proud of it. I felt terrible about certain aspects of it, but this was what I had to do. Archer in season 3 of Enterprise constantly saying, I did what I had to do. He says it to the guy whose warp coils he steals. He says it over and over again. It becomes this sort of mantra, basically. He says it even right at the end of season 2, I think, when they go off into the expanse, and Trip says to him, tell me we're not going to pussyfoot around, basically. We're going to, we're not going to do things the Vulcan way. We're going to kind of kick ass, sort of thing, and kind of really take this to the enemy. And he says then, we'll do whatever's necessary, we'll do what we have to. And so I think in a sense there's this kind of parallel built up between them. But there's this interesting episode, which is, I think, not a great episode. It's a bit of a weird one, Hatchery, where Archer gets imprinted on by these alien, the Zindi insectoids, and the Zindi insectoid babies, and he becomes very kind of protective of them. But there's this whole kind of discussion there about whether it's wrong, because they know they're the enemy. Also, they're insects, so they're kind of disgusting and weird and creepy and so on. But is it morally acceptable to kill these alien babies, basically, even though they're the babies of the enemy? And Archer, although he's not really himself, is sort of saying, no, there are certain things we don't do. We don't kill children. Even in a war, we go to any lengths to try and avoid child casualties and so on. And in some ways, I think with Degra, it's almost the fact that he has killed all these innocents, and he has killed these human children, that is kind of keeps being brought back, is almost, for me, that's sort of where this sense comes from, that however much he turns things around, however much he tries to help them, you kind of know he's going to die in the end. You kind of know from a sort of narrative point of view, he's gonna have to get it, because he's not going to be let off for those crimes. However guilty he feels, however much he tries to make reparations, however much even someone like Trip, who's been personally, deeply affected by the loss of his sister and so on, can kind of, almost come to a point of maybe not forgiving him, but sort of accepting what's happened to some degree, that there are these certain things that he's never going to get to go beyond. And I feel like repeatedly this kind of emphasis on children is one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting you mention, because obviously for those of you who don't remember, Degra was the creator of the Xindi weapon, which at the end of season 2 of Enterprise cuts a swathe through Florida and kills, many, many people. And then obviously leads to Archer leading the Enterprise into the Delphic Expanse in season 3, which is the overarching story of the entire season, to stop the bigger Xindi weapon, which is going to be targeted to destroy Earth, because they've been told that they will, the Federation, well, what will be the Federation, we don't know it's Federation yet, will destroy the Xindi in the 26th century. So in 300 years, they're trying to prevent what they've been told, and they're being manipulated by the sphere builders, and the temporal Cold War stuff going on. But they've been told that if you don't destroy these people first, they will destroy you. And what is interesting in the sense of what Degra is asked to build, and then his whole moral quandary about this, within a very hardline militaristic rest of the Xindi Council, who are pretty much all the way through. The majority of them are like, we have to do this, and they're all from all the different areas of the Xindi. Whether they're primates, whether they're insectoids, all of them, they're all singing from the same hymn sheet in many respects, in that we need to do this. And what's really interesting is that the whole idea comes back to the same thing, which was happening in the real world with Oppenheimer and the Germans. It's that whole idea with the Xindi: we have to do this, otherwise they will destroy us. And it becomes that sort of that standoff almost. But then every time two things happen, in both the cases of Jetrel ultimately and Degra, although Degra gets there while it's happening, they both feel that sense of that they shouldn't morally do this, that there are bigger moral, questions, that it's a weight on their soul that they've actually killed all these people, and that they both die, and that ultimately Degra is murdered and Jetrel dies.
And he dies because of his creation as well, because he dies
Yes.
of the radiation poisoning that he, in a sense, has unleashed through making this. So I suppose there's a kind of poetic justice in a sense. To that.
certainly for Jetrel, I think, but with Degra, it's a very different kind of death. But they're on we've talked about this before. What's interesting is that they're on the same path, but they're on different sort of versions of it in many respects. In that Jetrel, when we meet him, he's years after the event, facing his own demons, as reflected in what Neelix goes through and what he faces. But then Degra is in the middle of it. He's in the thick of it there and then. It's being asked that ultimate moral question, as you're about to do this: should you do this? Is this right? Are you actually going to kill millions of people? What's it for? Ultimately, based on a lie in the end, or based on lack of truth. But it's a different story with the same point, isn't it? Ultimately,
Yeah, definitely. And I suppose that's an interesting point, that it's not so much about, there is a certain amount of it is about his kind of guilt over the probe that's killed 7 million people, which obviously is an unimaginable, horrific thing. But it's true, the focus is more on, because that's the sort of ticking time bomb from a plot point of view, in this season of Enterprise, is this weapon's going to be launched that's going to destroy the whole planet. The focus is much more on the thing that he's about to do, and on him basically deciding not to do that and deciding to kind of take a different path. One of the other things I think is interesting about Degra, we talked a little bit about Jetrel as this kind of anniversary episode, 50 years later, looking back at the legacy of the Second World War, something that actually, this is something we might touch on in future episodes. Voyager, surprisingly, quite frequently deals with Second World War issues. We think of Deep Space Nine as being all about the Holocaust and about the Nazis and the treatment of Jews or of other groups that they felt were beneath them and so on, and the concentration camps. But actually Voyager touches on comparable issues in various ways sort of over the years. But I suppose what's interesting to me about the Degra situation is it feels to me, watching it, like it's almost there's a kind of element of sleight of hand there. It's quite a clever trick that by bringing in this character, they sort of change the rules of engagement in a way of that story. When you have the Xindi attack from the probe in that final episode of the second season, it's a very clear 9/11 allegory, very explicit, and this is happening only a couple of years after 9/11. And the kind of rhetoric of that whole season, quite controversially, this whole, we'll do whatever it takes, we'll kind of break the rules, in the first or second episode of that season, Archer is basically waterboarding a prisoner by threatening him, chucking him in the airlock and removing the oxygen and so on. There's this quite uncomfortable sense that that Star Trek is going in, it's really kind of throwing the moral compass out the window in a sense. It's saying if the situation is bad enough, then all those kind of moral questions, all those kind of moral certainties we have about what we do as humans or as the Federation, I know it's not the Federation, etc., sort of go out the window. And a lot of people felt quite uncomfortable about it at the time. I mean, I saw an interview with John Billingsley, who plays Dr. Phlox, and he, as a long-time Star Trek fan, had a lot of problems with this and felt that it was... maybe it was topical, but that it was kind of morally they were taking the wrong position in a sense. And I think what they do with Degra quite cleverly is by making this Oppenheimer character at the centre of it, and kind of by sort of twisting the narrative round so you can see it from his point of view and you can see it in a sort of World War II context rather than a War on Terror context, is that changes it all, because the feelings that we have about World War II are very different from the feelings that we have about the War on Terror and the kind of contemporary conflict. And so in a way they managed to, as Brannon Braga said in one of the interviews where he was sort of defending that whole storyline, he was sort of saying, well, yeah, maybe it starts off as this... he called it the kill the terrorists story, basically. But it ends up in this place of making peace, of kind of, Archer and Degra forming this bond, of this kind of optimistic sort of Star Trek message in the end. And the way they managed to do that, looking at what we're talking about history and culture and bringing our culture to bear on it, is through this kind of trick almost of starting off telling a 9/11 allegory and then switching it and telling a World War II allegory, because that kind of offers a route out of that impossible situation that they'd got themselves into, in a way, morally speaking.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting way of looking at it. It's very true, and it allows them to give both the characters of Jetrel and Degra in their own separate ways that element of redemption. It feels like the writers are very keen to almost give them what Oppenheimer never quite got in many respects. That point of, Jetrel, when he turns up on Voyager, his ultimate goal, at the end, it seems like, he's up to no good, but his ultimate goal is to try and reconstruct and reconstitute it's admittedly quite a far-fetched idea, even for, Star Trek, but he's trying to reconstitute the atomic structure of these people who were destroyed on Rhinax, who were it's the equivalent of Oppenheimer having gone to Japan, in 1963, with technology that allowed him to bring back all the people in Nagasaki who were just, obliterated by the bomb. And actually trying to, and saying to the people there, I can bring these people back. If I made it, I created something horrible, it didn't almost mean what it should have meant, and I can bring these people back. And then he dies at the end, having been able to be forgiven by the very symbol of the people he destroyed. When Neelix says, I forgive you at the very end, he is admittedly forgiving himself, but he's also forgiving Jetrel. And with Degra, it's that case of his redemption comes in the fact that he manages to convince almost all of the Xindi Council that Archer's right, that, they are being manipulated. They don't need to do this to Earth, and it's only the Dolium character who's the one who ends up taking it. He's the hardliner. He's the one who ends up trying to take it on and destroy the planet and everything like that. And he becomes your ultimate villain in the end. But they both achieve that level of redemption and die for it in many respects. And I think the writers were very keen for that to happen, to give it an almost tragic arc to a character who was based on a man who had a certain tragedy to his life, even though he'll always be remembered. There is a certain tragedy to everything, as they were all the destroyer of worlds.
Well, literally, Jetrel and Degra, that is precisely what they are. Whether that's Rhinax or Earth, really, that's what they're working to do, is to destroy those worlds. There's also this kind of thing about understanding your enemy, understanding your enemy's motivation. When this India attack happens, and just to go back to the kind of 9/11 allegory, it seems incomprehensible. Do you know what I mean? Who are these people? Why have they attacked Earth? They see, and all we know about them is that they want to completely obliterate our civilization. They want to sort of wipe our culture off the face of the Earth. And it's only later that we learn that they believe that they're doing it in terms of, sort of self-preservation and so on, and that they feel it's a sort of preemptive strike to save themselves. And I suppose that's, that it changes very much our understanding of who these people are and why they've done this terrible thing to us that to begin with is just so incomprehensible, so inexplicable, which I guess in those scenes in that early episode when the attack first takes place at the end of season 2, there is a real kind of 9/11 feeling of that kind of not just horror, but sort of bewilderment and kind of shock and kind of, who are these people and what do they have against us? Why do they hate us so much that they would do these things? And kind of, particularly from a kind of American perspective, I think really just struggling to comprehend that and to comprehend. I mean, and it's not just an American thing. We all suffer from these days from Islamic or Islamist terror attacks and so on. And I think there is that kind of struggle to understand, why does this person on the tube or this person at Westminster recently, why does that person want to kill me? Do you know what I mean? If I'm the one who happens to be there. And it is something that's very hard to grapple with. And in a way, by constructing this character of Degra and constructing this kind of backstory and this kind of World War II allegory, they kind of get away from that and get it into an area where we can kind of understand where he's coming from and sympathise with him very much.
And I think that's one of the key things. That's absolutely true, and I think that's one of the key things with Star Trek, and one of the things that makes, even if the Enterprise story, especially with Degra and with that whole season 3 arc, is to many people quite intense, not necessarily Star Trek in its construction. I think ultimately it is, in the sense of what it's trying to say is that we can reach that point of understanding. We can reach that. That rapprochement, in which we get there and we figure each other out, and that we can talk about it. We can sit down and talk about it, and in order for the season to have a villain, as I mentioned, they need somebody, they need a hardliner, they need an extremist to go out there and still try and, finish the job. But in many respects, that Archer is able to go there after some turmoil and going through it. He's able to sit down with these people and say, this is who we are, this is what's actually going on. You don't have to do this, which is something that, and it reflecting our real world anxieties even now. Enterprise, this story was happening in like 2004, 2003, 2004. If anything, now we feel even more anxious and even more, worried about where, modern terrorism, where modern, politics is going, in that we seem to be moving further and further away from understanding each other. And I think Star Trek in this circumstance, and what, Brannon Braga and Rick Berman specifically wanted to do, is to tell a story, Manny Coto obviously, to tell a story which said, we can figure this out. We can figure this out. Even with this horrible, weapon, and with these threats of obliteration, we can figure out a better way.
I really like the Degra character. I mean, I don't know about you. I really loved Jetrel as an episode. I think I understand why some people have a lot of problems with season 3 of Enterprise, and I do think that there are quite a few missteps in that season, maybe, but I don't think Degra is one of them. I think Degra is one of the things that really saves that story, that makes it work, and also that, like you said, that makes it Star Trek in a sense, where in some ways that season was kind of veering slightly dangerously away from kind of what we understand Star Trek to be, and really that storyline kind of helps to pull it back. It's also, I was thinking about this thing you were saying about Archer kind of making this personal connection with him. I mean, there's this sense at various points in Enterprise that Archer is this kind of historic character. He's this kind of linchpin of history. He has this important role to fulfill, as we know, in the kind of temporal Cold War context. And even in this season, we see in the episode Twilight, we see this kind of potential future where Archer's out of action and T'Pol is in charge of this mission, and she doesn't manage it, basically. So there's this kind of sense of what is it that Archer's got that she hasn't? What is it that Archer's got that's going to enable him to succeed in this mission? And I mean, I think Archer is problematic as a Star Trek captain. He's not Captain Picard, he's not Captain Janeway, he's not even Captain Kirk or Captain Sisko. He there's something a bit folksy, a bit kind of often a bit sort of clueless about him. He's very much kind of finding his way a bit. He doesn't have that kind of authoritative command in some ways that some of the captains do. But I think one of the things that's quite good about this story is they sort of find a way finally of playing to his strengths. And, he does have this ability to kind of form a bond with this man, even though he's the enemy. He has this ability to kind of meet him in the middle somehow, to kind of, for them to understand each other. And obviously we see that in season 4 as well, that, his role in the kind of formation of the sort of incipient Federation, bringing these different races together. He's quite sort of inoffensive, Archer. People seem to get on with him. Even someone like Shran, who's very antagonistic, has this kind of respect for him. And really this sort of seems like this sort of comes out as almost his kind of defining characteristic as a captain, is this sort of interpersonal skill in a way. And that's what enables the solution of this this seemingly impossible situation. Because I suppose that's the thing about this Indy arc, is it seems like their mission is completely hopeless. You know, they're up against, the odds are so stacked against them, and so many things go wrong, and there are so many problems, and so much of this, and you know, but they do ultimately manage to solve the problem, but not in the way that they were expecting. And Trip says in one of the episodes, I think, shortly before Degra dies, where they're talking to him, he sort of says basically, I expect us to go in guns blazing. I thought we were going to find a kind of military solution to this problem. And they've kind of suggested that by bringing the Makos on board and beefing everything up a bit and beefing up the action and so on. But actually what they find is a diplomatic solution, which isn't really what anyone's expecting to be the outcome of that story going into it.
Yeah, and it's interesting that there are strong hints with Archer, and this may well have become, and I'm not familiar enough with the follow-on books and things like that, but there's a strong hint, I think, that he becomes the Federation president one day.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's
Federation
right.
president, and it could well be at the end of these the voyages we see that. But I think this episode proves it. You know, Zero Hour proves it, and how season 3 wraps up, in that he is that guy you can go in there and, you know, and make that. You know, that understanding with the Oppenheimer kind of character, and with that species, and reach, as I said, and reach a compromise, reach a better way, and reach that one thing that, you know, on the flip side in Voyager, you know, the Talaxians and the Harkonnens never really did, you know, and you had that character much later on finding his own, you know, trying to find his own sense of redemption. So I think they're two very interesting, very different, but very interesting characters on a similar course at different stages of their life, in very different situations, with very different reasons. But do you think that the allegory works for both of these characters?
I think it works. I mean, I suppose I'd say, yeah, I really like both these characters. I think they're both really interesting. So I think it works in that sense. I mean, I think in terms of Jetrel, it's a very sort of straightforward, conventional Star Trek allegorical take on a real story, and that's not a bad thing. I think it's done very well. With Jetrel, you even get direct quotations essentially from Oppenheimer. He uses the words "brighter than 1,000 suns" to describe the weapon, which is very similar to the phrase "the radiance of 1,000 suns," which comes from the Bhagavad Gita, from the quote that you mentioned earlier, and also the positions that he articulates about you know, the value of science, about the level of his responsibility, about who was making the decisions. There's a discussion in Jetrel about Neelix says, couldn't you have just given a demonstration of this weapon's power without killing anyone? Or couldn't you have chosen a military target? And these were debates that were being had at the time as they were preparing to drop the weapon on Japan. And basically what Jetrel says is kind of the position that the US Army took, that they needed to prove how devastating this weapon was. And just a demonstration, you know, that didn't kill anyone wouldn't cut it. It wouldn't end the war in the way that, you know, in both World War II, you know, very soon after the second bomb was dropped, the Japanese finally surrendered. We heard in the case of the Voyager episode, the very next day, I think they said that they surrendered. You know, it wouldn't have had that impact. So I think Jetrel works on quite a sort of straightforward allegorical level. Degra, I think it works insofar as I think that character works, and I think that character obviously is inspired by Oppenheimer, but also in a sense, as I've sort of said earlier, is inspired by this kind of idea of Oppenheimer as this guilt-racked scientist that maybe is a bit of an exaggeration and sort of doesn't really take into account it's not that Degra isn't complex. I mean, I think Degra is a complex character, but in that respect it kind of definitely pushes in that particular direction. And that's the way that they saw it. There's an interview with Brannon Braga where he says, "We knew we wanted to create an Oppenheimer-like character." This is the quotation. "He was the mastermind behind building the bomb, very committed to his species, but racked with guilt, just like Oppenheimer." Now, whether or not we think that Oppenheimer is rightly described as racked with guilt or not, is, as we've sort of talked about, a complex question. You know, there was an element of, you know, he wasn't completely unmoved by that side of it and by the kind of moral responsibility of it, but he also, you know, didn't necessarily regret what he'd done or even think that they'd done the wrong thing. I mean, as far as he was concerned, they'd saved many American soldiers who would otherwise have been killed, and that ultimately was their job. So I think that Degra works in a slightly different way maybe as less of a kind of precise allegory, but more in terms of kind of, as I said earlier, sort of moving the narrative in a different direction and giving us a different perspective. And as you said, bringing in this kind of element of redemption and this element of kind of rapprochement and kind of building bridges and really finding a sort of Star Trek solution to what seemed to be a very un-Star Trek problem.
Yeah, definitely. And putting those moral questions, which is what Star Trek does so well, putting those moral questions front and centre while still telling a good story, you know. And in Enterprise, it's a much more action-packed, you know, fast-paced story, as befits, you know, more modern television. With Jetrel, it's much more of a, you know, of a stage play in a way. It's as you said before, it's almost like a two-hander in many respects, and often with those characters. So it's two very different approaches to a really great allegory, and a really important one, I think, for Star Trek to tell, especially in this day and age. If anyone wants more information on the man of Oppenheimer, I heartily recommend a book that I've been reading called American Prometheus by Kai Bird, which is a book that took 25 years to write. So you can imagine how how huge this is. And it is Oppenheimer's complete life story. It talks right from his birth all the way to his death and covers all of these different things, and it is a truly fascinating book which gets into all kinds of things in terms of, you know, his physics, the atom bomb, his communist leanings, and all the kind of things that are rippling under with that. There's tons in it, so I hugely recommend that if you want a little bit more information about the man who inspired these really great Star Trek characters.
I would just add to that a recommendation, slightly more equivocal maybe than Tony's, for if you're interested in the character Oppenheimer. There's a movie which it goes by a couple of names. It's either called Fat Man and Little Boy, which is a reference to the name of the bombs, or it goes under the name Shadow Makers, which is a slightly better title maybe. But what's interesting about it is it shows you the story of Los Alamos. It shows you the story of Oppenheimer and the development of the bomb, and also some of the other scientists who were around at the time, and some of the civilians, nurses, and other people working on that site. And it does deal with a lot of the kind of moral questions, while I think painting a reasonably accurate representation of Oppenheimer and his own kind of ethical and moral position. The other reason to watch it, if you're a Star Trek fan, is that Oppenheimer is played by Dwight Schultz, alias Reginald Barclay, and is a surprisingly good kind of leading man. Really, I mean, he's a bit anguished. He's a bit sort of he's a bit of a kind of genius character, I suppose. So he's got that sort of intellectual, slightly awkward intellectual side, but he is also very much the kind of charismatic leader, the kind of all those things that we talked about. And it's whatever you think of the film, I mean, it's a slightly sort of workmanlike, tending towards the slightly boring side, but it is an interesting story. It's well made. It's a well-made film, and it's a great central performance by Dwight Schultz. So if you're interested in him and you're interested in the story, then definitely worth checking that out.
Well, brilliant. I'm definitely going to look that up for extra stuff with Oppenheimer once I finish my book, once I finish American Prometheus, which I'll be still doing for a while. But yeah, do look at those things, guys, if you want a bit of extra context for the kind of things we've been talking about today. So, well, we hope you've enjoyed this first episode of Primitive Culture. I think we've enjoyed batting these issues around and talking about these characters and this little slice of history. So yeah, we'll be back very soon, won't we, Duncan, for some more cultural and historical Trek.
We sure will. Look forward to it.
Yeah, me too, absolutely. But Primitive Culture, of course, isn't the only thing that's been happening on Trek FM right now. So let's have a look at what else has been happening this week on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, Standard Orbit.
Best of Both Worlds. It's a good episode. I enjoyed it. I remember when it first took off. Family was 100 times better to me. I'd watch Family 10 times to 1 over watching Best of Both Worlds or Inner Light. Those are the types of things that interest me. And I do enjoy the action-adventure pieces of it. I truly do. But I love seeing the characters, and that's why Wrath of Khan works.
Warp 5.
It was just mesmerizing to me. And I remember when my dad, a long time ago, had an airplane. He would take us up flying, but never, we'd hold the wheel and say, hey, we're flying an airplane. But I never really was bitten by the flying bug. But it happened right there on a runway in Hawaii, on Oahu.
The 602 Club.
And we saw it in the first Alien as well. I mean, like, the company sent them to the planet to bring that alien back, right? And I didn't remember the part where in this film where Burke sent the colonists to go and find the ship on his own without authority from the company. I had forgotten that part. So that was kind of an interesting revelation, seeing this movie for the first time in 12 or 13 years, however long it's been since I've seen this.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So check out all of these shows and join in the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published. And please do leave us a star rating and a written review at the same time. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. If you'd also like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/trekfm, that's patreon.com/trekfm, to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, the Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/trekfm. Duncan and I would love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to get involved and do just that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. You can find Duncan and I on the Babel Conference as well, and you can find us both on Twitter, Duncan at Barrett's Books, and myself, Tony, at Black Hole Media. And you can also find me hosting my own podcast, the Xcast and X-Files podcast, if you type that into Twitter and Facebook. So thanks everyone for listening to this episode of Primitive Culture. We'll be back soon to discuss more history, culture, and how Star Trek relates to it.
You're blended all right.
I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer